Hello everyone and welcome to the IFST Spring Conference webinar series, The Appliance of Food Science. My name is Helen Munday. I am President of the Institute of Food Science and Technology. Throughout this series, we will be showcasing the very best in food science and, in particular, its application through the very latest in technologies. We will be celebrating the hugely positive contribution food science and technology makes in ensuring the food sector continues to deliver. These presentations were originally part of the programme for our spring conference, which has had to be cancelled due to the current COVID-19 crisis situation. We are very pleased to be able to still bring you these presentations via webinar every Wednesday throughout April into May. I would like to thank the Food and Drink Federation for kindly sponsoring this series of webinars. We would also like to thank our corporate sponsors, Marks & Spencer, Nutraceuticals Group, IFST and Camden BRI, who provide sponsorship throughout the year, which helps IFST to deliver many of its charitable activities. I hope you enjoy this webinar and would encourage you to register for other webinars in the series. With that, I hand over to Natasha Medhurst, IFST Scientific Affairs Manager.
Thank you, Helen. Our speaker today is Sterling Crew. Sterling is a well-known public health and food commentator and chair of the IFST Food Safety Special Interest Group, with over 35 years' experience in the food industry. For more information on his biography, please look on our website. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Sterling.
Thank you, Natasha, for your kind introduction. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today I'm going to talk about the coronavirus, COVID-19, and ask the question, does it present a food safety risk? In this session, I will attempt to review the current scientific evidence and advice relating to the virus's impact upon our food industry and food safety. We live in the most extraordinary and increasingly difficult times with the global public health threat posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 is a novel virus. It is a new strain that has not been previously identified in humans, so there is still a high level of uncertainty about the virus. In such uncertain times, it is important that we use tried and tested sources and that we are guided by scientific principles and medical advice. I will discuss both the direct and indirect potential impact of the virus on food safety. So firstly, the direct impact on food safety. There is currently no evidence that food is a source or transmission route of COVID-19, and it is very unlikely it can be transmitted through the consumption of food or via its packaging. Trusted sources such as the Food Standards Agency, Food Standards Scotland, the European Food Safety Authority, the American Food and Drinks Administration and the World Health Organization are very consistent in their advice that the risk of contracting novel virus COVID-19 through food is very low. The Food Standards Agency has published guidance for food businesses on COVID-19. It has been developed with the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and covers a range of areas including good hygiene practice, management of employee sickness and social distancing for specific food business settings. I would highly recommend it. Within it, the Food Standards Agency states, it is very unlikely that people can catch COVID-19 from food. COVID-19 is a respiratory illness and not known to be transmitted by exposure to food or food packaging. So we should remind ourselves and others COVID-19 is principally a respiratory illness and that the transmission route is thought to occur mainly through direct contact with respiratory droplets generated when an infected person coughs or sneezes. The European Food Standards Authority reiterates the opinion, saying There is no evidence that food is a likely source of COVID-19. However, it does emphasise that it's still closely monitoring the scientific literature for new and relevant information. Some of this opinion is extrapolated from information gathered from similar outbreaks of related coronaviruses, such as severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, SARS, and Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome coronavirus, MERS, where it is noted that the transmission through food consumption did not occur. At this moment in time, there is no evidence to suggest that COVID-19 is any different in this respect. We must bear in mind, however, that COVID-19 is a novel virus and still not much is known about it. We then come to the consumer and the court of public opinion and the nature of the certainty of risk. We are all consumers of food, and that is why it's so personal for people. It sustains and nourishes us and plays a big part in our culture. The public sometimes struggles to understand scientific qualification around certainty, such as there is no evidence, or it's highly unlikely that. The public are looking for certainty in uncertain times. Or, to use the old scientific maxim, for them, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is natural that people's behaviour in dangerous times is instinctively driven by an innate precautionary principle. By far, the most common question I'm asked is, what happens if an infected person touches an apple in a supermarket or sneezes over some packed food? Yes, there is a theoretical risk. There is a theoretical possibility to transfer the virus. But in my opinion, it's far more likely you can get it from the person who is sneezing next to you. But to some, this appears to be somehow counterintuitive. So, there is no direct evidence that food is a source or transmission route of COVID-19. It is very unlikely it can be transmitted through the consumption of food or its packaging. No likely direct impact on food safety then. But what about the indirect impact on food safety? The global food sector is being impacted both economically and socially across the entire food chain in relation to human resources, such as changes in key personnel who might inevitably become absent. And supply chains of ingredients, packaging, finished products and equipment will change. They might become more limited. Manufacturers may need to rely on alternatively previously unknown suppliers at very, very short notice. Along with the transportation of people, materials and goods which pose a threat in just-in-time delivery or delivery at all. Taking on new staff will require training and inoculating them with the business's food safety culture. No mean task, as some might not have a food background. We have seen the breakdown of the third-party auditing process, which helps drive continuous improvement, food safety and quality, and gives a degree of assurance to customers. All of the GFSI recognised food safety certificate programs have issued official positions on how they are handling new certifications and recertifications in response to the current pandemic, and these are posted on their websites. It is interesting this crisis might well hasten the move towards remote audits in the future. In my opinion, all these factors do have the potential to impact negatively on food safety, as the current situation is extremely disruptive and it is stressing the whole food supply chain system and its capability. In our legitimate concerns to feed the nation and provide food security, a real first in my lifetime, we should be careful that in our haste to provide this much needed food, we do not inadvertently compromise food safety. The food sector must continue to adhere to good manufacturing and food safety practices, procedures, processes, We are fortunate that food professionals and handlers are already well informed and trained in food hygiene, hand hygiene, and cross-contamination in food service and factory operations. We already have robust controls in place. Many of the control measures for preventing the spread of the virus are already embedded in our food safety culture, process and controls. Hygiene, cross-contamination and hand washing are in our sector's DNA. Employees in food processing facilities should continue to follow good food safety practices. This is a good time to review and verify you have proper cleaning and sanitisation procedures and frequencies in place. Although not a direct food safety issue, you may need enhanced cleaning of frequently touched surfaces in other areas outside of production and beyond the hygiene junctions, such as offices to prevent person-to-person spread of the COVID-19. Particularly focus on the high-risk areas such as break rooms, locker rooms, first aid areas, and surfaces like doorknobs, handrails, telephones, taps, electronics, etc. Remember, some critical members of the facility's technical and operational teams who impact upon food safety may not always be based in the factory, such as MPD teams and supply chain members. If these key staff go absent, this could potentially impact food safety. We know that the virus can survive on surfaces for varying levels of time. The virus survives for a shorter time on cardboard compared to stainless steel. I refer you to the study published in the New England Journal of Medicine on the 17th of March earlier this year. Results of this important study report similar stability of COVID-19 on different surfaces as the closely related coronavirus, SARS. The highest stability of COVID-19 was observed on plastic, 72 hours, followed by stainless steel for 48 hours. COVID-19 was much less stable on cardboard, 24 hours, and copper, 4 hours. COVID-19 was also tested in aerosols, where after 3 hours, viable COVID-19 was still detected. These results re-emphasise the importance of following proper hand and respiratory hygiene practices, as well as social distancing. In terms of routine cleaning and disinfection regimes for food contact and processing equipment, the message is to carry on as normal, with an overlay of a product capable of inactivating viral contaminants for those common contact points. Specifically, a product tested against BS EN 14476. Whilst this standard does not include the newly identified COVID-19, it does contain rotaviruses, which are also an encapsulated virus. The World Health Organization have reported that products based on hydrogen peroxide, peracetic acid, or sodium hypochlorite are all effective against the coronavirus family, as are solutions containing greater than 60% alcohol. I'd like to refer you to the Guide to Cleaning and Disinfection Regime with regards to novel coronaviruses, which has just been published by the Society of Food Hygiene and Technology. Food businesses are fortunate to have tried and tested management systems such as HACCP, TACCP and VASAP. We should remind ourselves that when the food supply chain is under pressure, unscrupulous people will try to take advantage of shortages and reduced oversight. We need to reinvigorate our authenticity approach for economically driven food fraud, which of course can bring with it consequential food safety risks. When this pandemic ends, and it will end, we all have to adjust to a new normal. I do not believe things will go back to the way they were. Review how your food business can manage new food safety and authenticity related risks, and how to take action to mitigate them. Hopefully, you already have a crisis management and contingency plan. Although I'm not sure how any of us could have predicted the scale of this human and economic disaster. I wrote an article highlighting the potential disproportionate economic impact on food businesses of the virus in January, earlier this year. I was criticised in some quarters as a doom monger, but now, on reflection, I had not gone nearly far enough. I had not nearly described the dramatic consequences that we've seen in front of us. They're almost inconceivable. At the time, some classically minded critic called me a Cassandra, who was the ancient Greek prophet of doom. I read up about her, and the thing about Cassandra was her prophecies, unfortunately, came true. Please remember, all good crisis management systems should have an exit plan out of the crisis. So please take the opportunity to plan to recover as soon as possible. We are in a time of contradiction. Some food businesses have never been busier. Due to the hoarding, we are seeing sales figures more like a Christmas. But of course, the industry then prepares for a whole year for Christmas. This has all occurred in a couple of weeks' notice. I'm amazed how the industry has responded so quickly to our nation's call. And conversely, what a dreadful time we have seen in the food service sector, with restaurants, hotels and pubs closing their doors to the public. Some are surviving by converting to takeaways and using online delivery platforms. The movement from a restaurant to a takeaway has its own potential food safety risks. They might not be used to dealing with the extra food safety controls that you'll find in a takeaway, such as ensuring allergen labelling is clear. Those that have closed restaurants need to ensure that they take the right precautions when they close. They should ask themselves, have they stored food properly? Is it being kept at the right temperature? Will they continue to check their premises? Will they guard against potential pest infestations? And then, when they're ready to start up, have they put the right precautions in place so that it is safe when they open? The sleepy Cotswold village where we live appears to have gone into total hibernation, as social isolation has really kicked in. People are now safe behind their closed doors in their homes, protecting our NHS. But that is the tip of the iceberg. What lies beneath the water unseen? I'll tell you, the food industry workers, from those working on our farms right through to the people manning the tills in our shops, working hard, every one of them, to ensure our nation is fed. I'm so proud to work in our industry. Let's honour our colleagues wherever they work in the food supply chain. Heroes, one and all. Stay safe, spread the word, not the virus. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sterling. Such an interesting and insightful presentation. Really topical, of course. Also, congratulations on being awarded the IFST Honorary Fellowship for 2020. So we're now moving on to the Q&A session. Accompanying Sterling on the panel today are two gentlemen. We've got Andy Kerridge, who's Vice Chair of the IFST's Food Safety Group. He's also Chair of the IFST Midlands branch. And also Chris Gilbert-Wood, who's Chair of IFST's Scientific Committee. All of the panel are key members of the IFST's COVID-19 Advisory Group. And they're here as a panel to attempt to answer your questions regarding the practicalities of managing any relevant food safety risks in the food sector. So it's good news that we've already got some questions coming in. So thank you to everybody so far. Sterling, the first question is asking whether you could expand a little about authenticity, how that relates to food safety, and where we can get more information.
It's a very good question. Thank you, Natasha. I think food safety and food fraud are very closely linked. And as we've seen in the past with economically driven food fraud, such as with melanin and the adulteration of baby food, there are some tragic consequences that can come out of this. There are food shortages at the moment, and this is when criminals start to move in. We've seen it already. I don't know if any of you have been onto Facebook Marketplace or other online platforms, but people are already offering an alternative route for face masks, where some of the origins seem a bit dubious, and for food itself. A lot of people are now selling food on the online platforms and bypassing all the ways that they have of being overseen by the regulatory authorities. Guys, if you need some information, can I refer you to the Food Authenticity Network? It's a great network, it's free to join, who are publishing papers and giving directions of the type of things that we need to be doing in these difficult times.
Thanks. We've got our IFST update, and that will have links to various external organisations. So somebody's brought our attention to the gov.uk guidance on decontamination in non-healthcare settings. So just point everyone towards that as well. So another question, that's around hand washing, for which IFST do have a fact sheet, but the question is around what's the most effective way of washing your hands, whether it would be using soap and water or using an alcohol gel.
Another very good question, and perhaps we could discuss a bit of the science behind it. So both are effective, but for me, I always go to washing my hands first. And sanitizing gels are great if there's not a wash hand basin nearby, but they both act in completely different ways on the virus. And we shouldn't forget there is a big difference when it comes to cleaning a bacteria, getting rid of bacteria, which is a living organism that respires and requires nutrition, and a virus, which isn't. So you don't actually kill a virus because it's never been alive in the first place. And the way that you attack the virus depends on the type of virus it is. You have encapsulated viruses and unencapsulated. And almost counterintuitively, it is the encapsulated virus that soap works best against. And COVID-19 is an encapsulated virus. It has a lipid structure on the outside, and what the soap does is break down that lipid structure, and then you can deactivate the genetic material. When it comes to alcohol, it acts more like a disinfectant. I would advise you to go to alcohol sanitizers that have more than 60% alcohol. Natasha, the question people ask me most often is, can I use my gin at home to clean my hands? I would not advise it. It's a waste of good gin. And the average gin, or most popular brand in this country, is only 37.5% alcohol.
Thank you. So this question directed at Chris, perhaps, given your extensive experience in manufacturing. So the question's around, there's obviously more pressure on organisations now, manufacturing particularly, and the question is whether shortcuts are being taken with reduced focus on monitoring, potentially on effective labelling, pack information and so forth.
I think actually many of the audience out there will understand what's going on in food manufacturing and probably better placed than me to answer the question, but I don't think that'll be the case. I actually think one of the things that we're learning about this, the challenge that's facing at the moment, is that if we continue to do all the things we currently do to make sure that the food we sell is safe, legal, says what it is nutritious and actually good to eat, then we will protect everybody from this new emerging risk. It is just an emerging risk. Our normal systems and procedures, if implemented. Now, what is a challenge at times now is people are having to change very quickly. But it still means you can go through the procedures. It just means you have to get the right people on the end of a phone and just do your sensible checks and all the things you would normally do in a change management process. So that which we normally do will protect us at a time like this. Sadly, Sterling's right. There will be people out there, there will be chances out there who are using this as an opportunity to do something. But again, we've all spent a lot of time looking at HACCP, TACCP and VASCP and working out ways to protect ourselves. And if we continue to implement those procedures, we'll continue to protect our businesses.
Thanks, Chris. So one of the questions here, perhaps for you, Andy, would be about auditing. So the question of remote auditing has come up, and whether we've got any guidance or advice on how that would be undertaken.
Well, we don't have any advice or guidance yet on remote auditing, but I think the crisis has brought to the front the opportunity that we've been looking at for the last few years of remote auditing. You know, it's not new technology. Okay, it's not perfect, but with things like Google Glass and others in that field, it's a real opportunity to get away from this focus on a once-a-year activity, albeit some factories have many audits during the year, and to go for remote monitoring rather than remote auditing. You know, crises, whether it be world wars or pandemics or whatever, are hotbeds for invention and innovation. And you know, the pressure that is being put on here in terms of auditing and sites not able to, you know, having to extend their certification, new sites not being able to enter the supply chain. This is a perfect opportunity, and you know, I'm a little bit sad about the missed opportunity that has been the stance from GFSI and others, where we could have had something there. That's my viewpoint. Anybody else on the panel got a view?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this is a time where we may well see some innovation in this area. I also think that, you know, audit is a useful tool in amongst a big toolbox of ways to assess activities up and down the supply chain. There are many other things, and people have started to talk about beyond audit. People are talking about other methods, and I think all of those are still useful. So, yes, we're not doing the third-party audits. Yes, they are a good way, but there are other things that you can do, and there are other things which were being done beyond audit. So it's part of our toolkit. It's not the only bit that you use to control your supply chain. But I'm very much with Andy. I think this is a big opportunity to look at life beyond audit and how we make sure that we're doing all the other things about checking, looking at some of the metrics from a business, looking at other things you can measure, and putting audit into the toolbox rather than everybody just relying on it.
I think that's a fantastic point, Andy, that you make there, that crises accelerate innovation. We've seen it on respirators and other technologies that are coming out. And I think Andy's exactly right. The processes that we think might have taken another 10 years to implement are being implemented in months. And I think it will compress the time when we'll see a completely different type of monitoring within our supply chains.
Thank you. So around myth busting and all the information that we're all getting from social media and so forth, the questions around whether there's an increased risk in the advice that people are receiving or hearing about washing the food products, so dipping them in bleach, for instance, or washing in their own domestic bath. So perhaps that's a question for you, Sterling.
Well, there is, at these times, the need to rely on a trusted source. So I always go to the WHO or other respected scientific institutions, but unfortunately, I think most of the public are getting their advice from something that could be described as fake news, or certainly sites that aren't using scientific principles. But there is that public concern, intuitively to them, that they think that they should be washing or disinfecting food. I don't recommend it. I think you should be washing your fruit and vegetables anyway, where relevant. But I don't think that using disinfectant in this format would be good because the people are using it. No, accepting that our salads are chlorinated anyway as part of the safety process. But I think it's just using practical, sensible conclusions and not exposing yourself to another food safety risk while you attempt to sort another one out.
I think there's also a risk of damage to people. There's no sort of recommendations of using bleach or other to clean vegetables at home. And people that I've seen, a small amount of bleach. Well, a small amount of bleach to one person, maybe a bucket full to another, and the chances of damage to the person and tainting of the food. I've seen recommendations for washing the vegetables with soap and water. If you try washing an iceberg lettuce or whatever with soap and water, you're just going to end up with bubbles coming out of your mouth because you're never going to be able to rinse it all off. So, anybody else?
I've got nothing to add to that. I think it's back to people should continue to do what they've always done. Remember, we're talking about, because I'm watching some of the questions, there's a number on this theme. We're talking about a theoretical risk of active coronavirus being on food, probably people touching it and then getting it near their mouths, because there is no evidence of you getting it by ingesting the virus. So normal good kitchen food practices will protect one another, will protect you and your family. So no, I don't think there should be that sort of advice, and carry on doing what you should be doing.
That sounds like sound advice. So regarding the recent issues of empty shelves in store, rationings and limits to certain quantities and certain categories of food, Chris, do you think there's going to be a shortage of food at any stage?
I think at the moment, what we're seeing is the food industry have done a fantastic job pulling together and filling up the supply chain again. So at the moment, I think there's not a shortage, but there is no doubt that as the global supply chains that we all rely on, as we see the disruption and we get a measure of what sort of disruption there's going to be, we're going to have to be fleet of our foot, and there is going to be some shortage of things. I do not think there will be a food security issue. I don't think there'll be a lack of nutrition in this country, but there may be a lack of specific ingredients and specific things that we've become to rely on.
Natasha, could I put that in a different way? Not only do we not have a shortage, we actually have an excess amount of food at the moment, but the food's in the wrong place. If you look at the food service and hospitality sectors, which have effectively closed down, it's estimated now that there's something like £25 million worth of food sitting in warehouses. This is perishable food that's going to go to waste because there's no way of getting it out to the public. So in fact, food waste is going to be huge over the next couple of months as people have hoarded perishable goods and it's going off, or that the food is sitting in other supply chains. And I think that's really important that we connect with our neighbours and food sharing organisations such as Olio, who I work for, to make sure that this food that is available is getting through to people who are struggling to get a hold of it.
I'll also add to that. I mean, I think there's some innovation in terms of some of the retailers taking food service products both here and in the States. Now, clearly we have to be careful about labelling because some of the multi-packs, etc., through food service are not individually labelled on the smaller packs. But if it's frozen or ambient, there's got to be other markets for that product. The chilled has probably already gone by now.
Okay, so moving on to another area, we've got plenty of questions on personal protective equipment, PPE, as we'd like to call it. And that's around, so open up to the panel, on whether masks are of benefit to food handlers, goggles, gloves, and so forth.
I'll go back to the trusted resource again, Natasha, and I always follow the advice of the WHO. There are only two groups of people that should be wearing masks, and you have to wear the right mask. Is it FFP3 or at least to that standard? And the WHO says it should be used by people who think or might have the COVID-19, or for people who are caring for people who might have or have demonstrated symptoms of COVID-19. At the moment, that is what the WHO has said, but every business has to carry out a risk assessment, the same they would for any health and safety issue, and they have to do an assessment to make sure, is PPE appropriate? But on the hierarchy of control that you see from the HSE, normally PPE is the very last thing at the bottom. So I think it's for each individual business to look at its each unique circumstance and respond to the risk it poses.
I think I'd just like to add to that, that as part of that, if you go back to, and first point Sterling's made is the right place to go is the WHO, the stuff we're getting from the PHE, and I must say, I actually think the government are doing a good job at the moment of getting good, sound information out there. Now, they're not answering every question because some of the questions aren't being asked, but I think there's enough information out there to navigate through what you should be doing. And anybody who isn't registered to get the daily update, get yourself registered. You get the update of everything that's changed in the morning. Now, going back to what Sterling said about the risk assessment, people are talking about masks if you're caring for people with it or if you've got symptoms. Now, those people shouldn't be working in the food production environment. They shouldn't be working in any working environment at the moment. So that's one thing. I think, so this is about how do you do the social distancing? And I don't think masks are an answer to social distancing. The challenge is about doing the social distancing within food factories. And I think there is lots of good solutions out there. People are looking at distancing, looking at slowing lines down. If they can't get the distancing, they're looking to use perspex screens between people with good washing and sanitization procedures. And if you can't do that, people are providing visors. But the visors are very much, it's not about using that instead of having a face mask, it's about having your mobile perspex screen. So to me, I think the guidance is right, and there probably isn't any need, other than those people who already had to wear masks in certain areas of the food industry. If you're catching chickens and things like that, you did. I don't think people should be wearing masks in the food production environment unless you can think of something for your own specific risk assessment, which means you believe there is a risk to the people.
Thanks. So perhaps one for you, Andy. So have you got any experience or knowledge about laboratories having a drop-off in the amount of testing they're doing? So one particular attendee is asking about authenticity testing and saying that samples haven't been able to be submitted due to the inability to be able to get to shops, lack of freezer space in their homes, and ethical considerations about taking food that should really be for consumption.
No, I mean, I've heard of it. I haven't got any practical experience I can offer to the audience on that one. Anybody else able to help on that?
Only, Andy, that our industry is no different than a lot of others, isn't it? A lot of people are being furloughed or have to self-isolate because they might have an issue. So I think there's just less people out there in the factories, less people out there in the laboratories, and that must have an impact intuitively on the amount of tests they're capable of doing.
Yeah, social distancing in laboratories.
Yeah, very, very important. And the reagents themselves, some of the materials that they're trying to get hold of, obviously come from a long distance away, and some of those networks are broken down as well.
Yeah, it's definitely going to have a knock-on effect. So with regard to short, medium and long-term impact, do you think we'll have a change in how we protect the industry, or what should we do to protect from further shocks in the future?
I think there will be changes. As Andy said earlier, at a time when you put a system under stress, you learn a lot, and the innovators come out and you do things, you change things. So I think there will be changes which come out of this. Every time we face a stress, we learn things and we do things differently. So yes, I do think there will be longer term effects of how we improve the way we protect ourselves.
I think not just on protection, but the way that we actually make the food, Chris. I know that my son works in a bakery, and they're producing enormous amounts of bread at the moment with fewer staff. And so the whole organisation has almost looked at the way that it produces the bread, and on the back of it, I don't know how sustainable it is over a long period of time, but people are finding innovative ways of producing more food with less resource.
Yeah, I mean, it's just going to be creativity. I mean, it'll affect people in so many different ways. There's going to be companies looking at their office space and wondering, do we really need all this office space? It may not mean people working from home all the time, but I think the hot desks will become the norm much more in the offices. And people will also look at how they are backing up and their systems and accessibility. Paperwork systems, great when you're in the factory, not so great when you're having to work remotely. Payroll systems tend to be on maybe one computer. Well, that's great, but how many people can actually access it? So, it's all these stresses are going to throw out different ways of dealing with it.
I think the biggest area will be actually the impact on consumer behaviour. And what you're seeing now is people being more willing to use online platforms. Home deliveries obviously are becoming almost like a necessity rather than a luxury. And I think our whole way our industry works in the future could change dramatically, being driven by the change in consumer behaviour.
Natasha, can I've just noticed a question come up from an old colleague of mine, a follow-up to one of my answers, which I'd like to ask Sterling. So, as usual with me, I'm breaking protocol. So the question was, do we think the health and safety executive are going to be prosecuting or enforcement action on people who have not been able to provide 2-meter social distancing in their manufacturing plants?
That is a really good question. I just come off
I
the
hope
webinar.
you have a good answer.
I'll do my best, Chris. I never can give a good answer. I give an adequate one. Because the regulators, and I've been speaking to them, are not going out there with a big stick trying to bash people up. No, they're trying to encourage people. Really, they're there to support people through this difficult time. So the attitude isn't, let's go out there and see who I can nick today. It's about who can I support. But I think if you go into, it's more likely to be a small takeaway, and you can't have social distancing because the kitchen's too small and they're all on top of each other. But they might give advice, and then if they think that the advice isn't being heeded, they do have the capability of serving a prohibition notice under the Health and Safety at Work Act, which would stop the activity, perhaps reduce the numbers, put people on shifts. And if people are still ignoring the advice, they will look to prosecute. But I think they're in the same position as the police. I think most people now are just trying to support the nation because the prime objective is to get food to people. But yet at the same time, we shouldn't forget we've got to keep the food safe and we've got to protect the people who work in our industry.
Thank you.
So everyone's trying to adapt, and restaurants, for instance, who are forced to close, are trying to provide takeaway meals. Is there any advice they can get on allergen labelling in those situations where they're perhaps not used to doing such a task?
I think, again, there's some very good advice on the FSA website. I think restaurants repositioning to do takeaway and restaurants reproducing to do ready meals to deliver people. These are all fantastic initiatives and will be and to be commended, but we need to make sure that people are doing it safely. So I think there is some good advice on the FSA website for small businesses, and it's actually something that the IFST response group are looking at, is how we can get some simple, all the things which many people in the school take for granted, some simple advice to restaurant owners who've now turned into ready manufacturers, how they can do that safely. And that's something that we're looking to provide in the near future.
And in the meantime, we've obviously got the IFST fact sheet. So that's on the resources section of our website. And there's also an information statement, which is much more detailed, but that would help people understand which the European recognised allergens are and other allergens that should be of note.
But the restaurants should already know the allergens because they should be highlighting it to their customers on their served meals and menus anyway.
Yeah, that's true. It's the labelling requirements.
Yeah, it's actually labelling, yeah.
And as Chris said, we'll put some guidance out on that. Okay, so moving on to another area of manufacturing. So if one of the staff was diagnosed with COVID-19, what would the actions that the manufacturer should take? Would it be a recall, stop production?
I think if you look at the FSA guidance, they specifically talk about what happens if somebody starts to exhibit symptoms or indeed phones in afterwards. So their advice is that somebody needs to be escorted off the premises and sent home. You're then faced with, what do you do? Now, we're talking about a theoretical risk. I'm sure many of the businesses out there have already, or if you haven't, will be looking at increasing the cleaning which is going on for the food contact surfaces. Because the real risk here is that you've had somebody who was a symptomless carrier who has now reported in, and you think, oh, where have they been in the factory? What have they been up to? Now, if you're already working on the basis that this might be happening and you've increased your cleaning on your door handles, your touch screens, the on-off buttons and all the other places which people are regularly targeting, and I've seen some good work people have done early on where they were asking people to stick post-it notes during things that they touch regularly, and then using those post-it notes to provide a heat map of red areas which are touched a lot, amber areas not so much, and green areas, and then using that to increase their surface cleaning with the things which are known to get rid of the virus. And that way, making sure that even if there is somebody in the factory who is positive, that they are not going to pass that on to either the surfaces for others to touch, which is probably the biggest risk we're dealing with here, or indeed with normal food hygiene procedures, transmitting that onto the food. So I don't think it is a cause, and there's no evidence from the regulator that it would be cause for any of the procedures that you were talking about, Natasha. I don't know, Sterling, have you got a view on that?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect explanation of the position, Chris. I think the point to realise is there is a high number of asymptomatic carriers, those people that have the disease, can spread the infection, but you wouldn't know it from looking at them. So I think in a factory, I would assume that everybody's got it, and then start from that. If everybody's got it, then you must put social distancing, you must take the right precautions, because it's very obvious if someone's coughing that they've got it, and you can put actions in, but start from the position that maybe everyone's got it, and then you've got the right checks in place before you get yourself into a difficult position. Good point made, Chris.
I don't think so. Yeah.
In the supply chain, we've got various types of surfaces and materials. We've got plastic, we've got the outer cases that deliveries arrive in, we've got the stainless steel and so forth that you mentioned. So it's a question really about why does the coronavirus survive for different lengths on different types of surfaces and different types of materials?
I'm going to phone a friend on that one. I need to talk to a virologist.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
So I don't know the answer. I'm just trying to deal with the consequences, as most technologies have to through most things in life.
Yeah, so I guess it's a porosity and the actual substrate itself.
I knew a scientist had helped me.
I think Chris makes a very good point that I've never met so many amateur virologists in my life.
Yeah.
That everyone seems to have an opinion on how the virus is acting, but it is a novel virus, and that's why I direct people to the Journal of New England Medicine, which is the only source I know that's actually done the work on the virus on those different surfaces. So it's the only kind of research that you can trust because it's done on the virus, not extrapolating from other areas of research.
And also, few of us are normally thinking about viruses. Normally, with our actions, etc., it's about bacteria, and we're very familiar about the conditions that bacteria like living in and what they don't like. And then the viruses are completely different. And it's great that something as simple and widespread as soap and water is an effective measure against this virus. But yeah, it could have been so much different.
So already we're learning about new ways of working and enhancing our current good practices. So the question is around learnings and impacts, and what you think the most important changes should be, ensuring that we are more equipped for such issues in the future. Quite a general question there.
I think, I'm sorry, I'm beginning to be a broken record, but and I'm with Sterling. Did we see this one coming? I suspect many of the businesses out there had plans in place for the previous SARS outbreak, and probably the first thing they did when this started to grow was dust those down and see where that left them. So, but it's about many of the things which our businesses have in place to protect overall. So it's good horizon scanning. It is what is happening. Thinking about if that comes to fruition, don't treat the person, like Sterling said, he was seen as a doomsayer. No, what they're doing is that it's a legitimate risk. Now, you do have to work out whether that is actually going to impact on your business. What's the likelihood? What's the threat? So good horizon scanning, good risk assessment, and then good mitigations will continue to be the tools by which we deal with different things that are going to come at us. So yes, I do think there's lots of different ways, but I think the route through to develop systems and procedures and change the way we're working are about using the tools we currently have in the proper way. And my own bugbear, so they're actually real within your business, rather than something which you show the BRC auditor that you've got a bit of paper which says you do it. So my one watchword here, then make sure you're doing your horizon scanning, make sure you're doing risk assessment, your risk mitigation work, because you need to do it as a business to protect your business rather than to show an auditor once a year. I'll get off my soapbox now.
So that answers a question about how we would promote food safety culture amongst the workforce.
I think sorry, Chris, I beg your pardon.
I think promoting food safety culture is interesting because you don't promote a food safety culture, you lead a food safety culture. So the leadership of a business behaves in a way which means their workforce, the culture within their workforce, the way that you do things when people aren't watching is about the leadership of the business. So yes, it's a very important thing, and the way that, and to me, it's the bit of food management which we've been struggling with for a number of years, and in the last 10 years there's been a real step forward, which is how do we look at the way people behave and how do we factor that into all the system stuff we do. So we've been very good at checking systems and procedures in businesses, but we've been not very good. But the behavioural scientists have really done a good job for us to bring ways to judge how people are behaving within those procedures and processes. And as we develop that more and more and get to measure it more effectively and check alongside all other things, yes, that will protect our business. But I don't think it's about promoting as such. I think it's about demonstrating and leading.
I think, Chris, what this disaster has shown, that actually one of the critical tools that you have and the critical controls are changing people's behaviour. And in fact, I think that's where food safety comes in and behavioural science comes in. It's really emphasised, it's not about just training people and providing them with the method of control, but how do you actually change their behaviour so they follow the correct controls.
And the people are getting pretty much the same advice at work as they are getting when they're at home and out shopping and whatever. There's a very consistent message across the whole of the world as to the behaviour and not getting caught out by a different way of work, being at work and to what they are at home.
Okay. To answer your question, Natasha, about what the big impact, what the change is, I think it's really come out to me personally how it's important to adapt. And Charles Darwin, I'm a great fan of Charles Darwin, never said it's the survival of the fittest. That was never his phrase. He always said it was the survival of those that could adapt the quickest. And I think that's a lesson for our industry. The people that come out and they're strong and ready to expand and take advantage of the opportunities will be those that can adapt really quickly. And that's been the big lesson for me, how our industry has adapted to the challenges it's had.
So somebody who's dialed into the webinar today is in Rwanda, in Africa, and they've asked how a consumer can be sure a product's been prepared in a safe way. I think that's a general point, really, rather than a question, because we've already covered the fact that we should have trust in our manufacturers. There should be honesty, transparency of supply chain, also adequate traceability. Thinking about innovation going forward, I suppose people will be behaving in such different ways, having changed their ways of working and working more remotely. So perhaps more home cooking and that sort of thing. Do you think more from a behavioral point of view that people are going to change and therefore the manufacturers will have to adapt to the type of products they're launching?
I think the one thing we can definitely say about the food industry within the UK is it is fleet of foot and adaptable and will respond to consumer messages. So yes, but that's maybe the pace of adaptation and the direction of change has been influenced by, but the one thing that I can guarantee, the food industry will continue to adapt and change, and the pace of that change will increase at a time like this, but it's not as though we've been static.
So we've got time for just one more question now, because we're coming up to the hour. Sorry, Chris.
There's lots of questions on here about people still seem to be concerned about if there is a virus particle on the food, is that a problem? And I think we need to go back to the basics. This is a respiratory virus with no evidence of ingestion being the transmission vehicle. So this is what Sterling talked about, and I think he was right to put it from both sides. Yes, it's difficult at times when there's no absence of evidence is not evidence, but equally we need to be careful we're dealing with real risk and not theoretical risk. Some of these you can probably get together and convince yourselves are a theoretical risk, but we need to look at the real risks of other things around it and put it into context. And the evidence from the food safety professionals who've had the brains around the table looking at all of the risks, and the professionals and the scientists are saying there is no evidence that this is currently transmitted via food. And I think we do well to remember it.
So that's a really good sum up point, actually, Chris. Thank you for adding that. So I would like to, unless any of you have anything else to add, just say thank you to Sterling, Andy and Chris for giving such interesting and useful answers to the questions and a great presentation, as I mentioned, Sterling. Also, thank you to everyone attending today's webinar. If we didn't manage to answer your questions, then we'll try to do so afterwards via our email address, which is info@ifst.org, or via LinkedIn, and we'll aim to prepare a FAQ as well. So thank you again. Anything you want to add, Sterling, Andy or Chris?
Do remember, we're trying to put together resources for members, so if there are things that you're sat there wondering about, please get through to the email address Natasha read, and we'll try and work out a way to get the information out to everybody.
Thank you, everybody. And goodbye.